Hi, let's pray. Father, thank you for the gift of your word, and we thank you for the fact that we don't have to go through all the stuff that we go through alone. Thank you that we have each other to learn from. Thank you that we have your word to learn from. And Holy Spirit, pray that you would be in this place today, that you would bless everything that we say, and you would bless our ears as well, so that each of us would hear what you have to say to your heart. In Jesus' name. All right. So today, we're going to talk about the dynamic between Job's friends and Job. And we're going to start with, sort of where Henry left us off last week, right? And that's with the people who mean us well and who come to us because they love us when we are bereaved, and then say horrifically insensitive, hurtful things that make things very much worse, because their love is sincere, but it is incompetent. And so this is Proverbs 12:18. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. What Job's friends had to say did not bring healing to Job. So, and I want to emphasize something. I keep trying to tell you guys that you should push back at me. And I want to make sure you understand exactly why. When it comes to suffering, it's just not that easy to have a whole lot really useful to say if you haven't suffered. And C.S. Lewis, if you've read The Problem of Pain, I remember reading the book and feeling like it wasn't quite up to the standards of his other stuff, and I couldn't put my finger on why not. I couldn't find anything in it that I really disagreed with. The points, there were good points and everything, but it just wasn't. There was just something not quite on target about it, and I couldn't figure out why. He wrote that fairly early in his career. Late in his life, he fell in love, married, was ecstatically happily married for, I think, 3 years, and then lost his wife to cancer. And he kept a diary during the first few months after his wife died, and published that book as A Grief Observed. And if you read The Problem of Pain and then you read A Grief Observed, you can see exactly what is missing in The Problem of Pain, and that is that the problem of pain, and there's no one sentence, that you can put your finger on, but The Problem of Pain was written by someone who had thought a lot about suffering, and A Grief Observed was written by someone who had suffered. And it's very difficult to say the difference any better than that, but if you read the two books, you can see what I mean. He wrote a book called The Great Divorce, where it's obvious that he actually was aware of the fact that he was out of his depth when he was talking about pain and suffering. You guys can actually just go this way. It's fine. Don't try to pick your way through. In The Great Divorce, Lewis puts himself in as a character. Sort of like Dante puts himself into the character, puts himself into the Divine Comedy as a character. And towards the end of the book, he is talking to his mentor, George MacDonald, and he asks him some questions, and MacDonald gives him some theological insight about suffering. At which point, Lewis expresses a lot of discomfort. Lewis expresses a lot of discomfort about
it's still happening.
His giving these theological answers to people, and he says, could you you have the face to go to a bereaved mother in her misery when one's not bereaved oneself? And MacDonald's answer is very blunt. Just because there's a right answer doesn't mean you're the right answerer, right? That's no office of yours. You're not a good enough man for that. When your own heart's been broken, then it'll be time for talking. I don't know how many of you know that my wife works a whole lot with cancer patients who come here from China. And she also is an author and fairly widely read in places where everybody speaks Mandarin. And Light and Salt just published a book about the experiences of these cancer patients who are, that the Chinese medical system has given up on them. So they come to MD Anderson as a last sort of desperate thing. And so my wife and I wind up going to a lot of funerals, actually. And the book was essays written, a lot of them by the cancer patients themselves who come here and become Christians while they're here and talking about their experiences. But Helen has an exaggerated opinion of my godliness and my theological acumen, and she doesn't have a high opinion of her own. And so she felt like there needed to be at least one essay in there answering questions, because the cancer patients all ask the same questions. Why did this happen to me? What did I do that God is punishing me the way that He is? Right? And so she asked me to write it. And I wrote it because you need to keep your wife happy. But I was absolutely not qualified. And what I told her was, I'm not a good enough man. I haven't suffered enough. So I did the best I could do, but I can tell you it's not very good. And the problem with me teaching the class on Job is that I can read, but I haven't particularly suffered. And so when this is a new projector and I don't have it quite right, but basically the reason I keep telling you guys that you need to push back and you need to disagree with me is that I probably don't have it right. Okay, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily being clear. That I am someone who has thought a lot about suffering, but nobody that I have spent my life loving has died yet. Right? I haven't gone through anything like this. And last week, I was talking about, so for those of you who haven't necessarily been here the whole time, one of the things that's very striking about the book of Job is how little love there is in the book. Job, and in particular, Job is a very godly man. He's been very generous. He spent his life helping people. He, is always there for the widows and orphans. And yet, when things go bad for him, nobody shows up to help him except for his three friends who very famously would have been much better off not helping. Right? And so I drew a picture last week of Job being obedient to God, but not necessarily very good with people. And in particular, Job is clearly very proud of how righteous he is and what a good guy he is. Which we now know as Christians that God doesn't like pride. Job would have had at most the first 5 books of the Bible where pride is only mentioned once, and where there isn't any command, thou shalt not be proud of thy good deeds. So it's not a matter of open disobedience, but just that doesn't change the fact that people don't like it, right? That people don't like it when you're proud. So I had been talking about all this, and Henry, who has been very generous in sharing his own experiences, raised an objection about my treatment of Job's friends, because what he wanted what I was not necessarily adequately emphasizing is precisely this fact that someone can come to you out of love and do damage because they're incompetent. But they're still acting out of love. All right? And that's where I want to pick up today, is talking about that dynamic, and in particular, about how it plays out with Job. And I want us for a second, I've talked about how Job, we tend to think of Job as a Bible story, and we tend to not think of Bible characters as real people, and we tend to not think of Bible stories as real stories. So I want you to, instead of thinking about what happens to Job, I want us to think about modern day, we got a couple open up here, if you can get up there, but, or you can stand in the back. So, we are familiar with tragedy and with how the people that we know react, okay? So I want, instead of thinking about how Job and his friends react, I want you to think about, what if this happens now? How do we expect people to behave? So here's your story. My son Rusty is about 8 hours of driving experience away from getting his driver's license, and causing me to go bankrupt from insurance payments. So let's imagine that Rusty gets his license, that he's texting his friends or something, and runs a red light, and is killed. And a friend comes to comfort me, and among other things says something like, well, I'm sure you'll be more careful about how early you let Kai drive. Okay? Somebody is pretty much guaranteed to say something more or less this stupid. It happens. There are people who want to help, and they don't know what they're doing. So we'll assume that he says that. Now there's an obvious implication there, whether he means it or not, that my son is dead because I was a bad father. Right? Now, that won't be what he means. That will naturally be what I perceive. So, genuinely, sit and try to imagine that, right? Imagine how I would be likely to react. Because there's more than one sort of reaction. And we can call them the Jane Bennett answer and the Elizabeth Bennett answer. For those of you who've read Pride and Prejudice. For those of you who haven't, you're about to get a movie clip. The Jane Bennett response is, I'm sure he means well. Right? If you were listening, if you were here last week when Henry was sharing about some of the insensitive stuff that people had said to him, that's exactly what he said. I know that they meant nothing but my good. And so he was irritated, but didn't go off on them. But the other possibility is, I could be really upset and I could say, you're being a jerk. And what we're about to watch is a scene where Mr. Collins condoles with the Bennetts. For those of you, I can't assume that everyone's read Pride and Prejudice, although I wish I could. If you haven't, just go do that. It's one of my 3 Desert Island books.
Top 5 books.
It's an incredible book. It's a wonderful book. I have it largely memorized. I've probably read it 50 times. As a quick introduction to the characters, just so you'll know what's going on with the scene. This is Jane. She is the oldest daughter. She is not particularly smart, but she is very sweet, and she can't stand to think badly of anybody. This is her sister Elizabeth, who is the star of the story. She is very, very smart indeed, and she is a nice person except that she kind of has the habit of jumping to uncharitable conclusions about people. And sometimes Jane is being naive, and Elizabeth is right, and sometimes Elizabeth is kind of being hasty to pass judgment, and Jane is right. It just depends from one situation to the next. But you always know if one of them is going to jump to a bad conclusion about somebody else, it'll be her, not her. This is a stupid younger sister named Harriet. There is a fourth sister whom you will see briefly, who is primarily there for comic relief. But the fifth sister.
Sister Dog?
No, leave it off because we will.
You want it off?
I was going to ask someone to turn it off when the clip started, so we can go ahead and leave it off. The fifth sister is their 16-year-old sister who has brought catastrophe upon the family by heading off to London and living in sin with a man without bothering to get married to him first, which in the 1800s, absolute catastrophe for the family. Probably it would be better if she had been killed. And this is their cousin, Mr. Collins, the stupidest man in England. He means well. He is a clergyman, which in itself is tragic. Just imagining being a member of his congregation is just painful. He's married to her best friend, and there's a little bit of extra conflict due to the fact that he proposed marriage to her and she turned him down. So, he has heard the terrible news, and he has come to help.
Look who's coming! Who is it, Kitty? Mr. Collins, of course. Well, I'm not going to sit with him for anyone.
I had hoped to condole with your poor father and your mother.
Our father is still in London, sir, and our mother is not yet well enough to leave.
I feel myself called, not only by our relationship, but by my situation as a clergyman, to condole with you all on the grievous affliction you are now suffering under.
Thank you, sir. It has often been said that a friend in need is a friend indeed, sir.
Yes. Be assured, ladies, that Mrs. Collins and myself sincerely sympathize with you in your present distress, which must be of the bitterest kind, proceeding from a cause which no time can remove. The death of your sister would have been a blessing in comparison. And it is meant to be lamented, because there is reason to suppose, my dear Charlotte informs me, that this licentiousness of behavior in your sister has proceeded from a faulty degree of indulgence, though I am inclined to think that her disposition must be naturally bad. Now, howsoever that may be, you are grievously to be pitied.
We are very grateful, sir, for your...
In which opinion I am joined by Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter, to whom I have related the affair in full. They agree with me in apprehending that this false step in one sister must be injurious to the fortunes of all the others. For who, as Lady Catherine herself condescendingly says, will connect themselves with such a family?
Who indeed? Now, perhaps, in view of that consideration, you may feel that it would be unwise for you to stay any longer now.
Well, perhaps you are right. Yes, perhaps you are right, Cousin Elizabeth.
I always feel that a clergyman cannot be too careful, especially one so fortunate as to enjoy the condescension and the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Your thoughtfulness does you credit, Cousin Elizabeth. very, very sorry for you all.
Insufferable man. I suppose he means well. You suppose wrongly, Jane. His purpose in coming was to enjoy our misfortunes and congratulate himself on his own happy situation. I think it very kind of him to visit and condole with us. Is he gone? Yes. Good. Forever with any luck.
So, the reason that I wanted to go with this scene in particular, there's 3 more chairs left. The reason I wanted to go with this scene in particular, you know what, that one's broken, is that you've got these 2 different reactions, and they're 2 very different reactions, all right, between Jane and Elizabeth. And the difference in the reaction is 100% a difference between Jane and Elizabeth. There's only one Mr. Collins, right? There's not 2 guys who showed up and one of them was gloating and the other one was genuinely trying to be helpful. So, what's the fundamental thing that drives the difference between their 2 reactions?
What they thought, how they perceived this message.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Several weeks ago, I was talking about how it's not what other people do that drives how we feel. It's the stories we tell ourselves inside our minds about why they did it that control how we feel. Right? If I'm walking through a train and I trip over somebody's foot, if he was really trying to hurt me, but I think it was an accident, I don't get mad at him. If he didn't even see me, and I think he did it on purpose, I get mad. It doesn't matter what his actual intent was, it's the story that I tell myself about what his intent was, right? And so the difference between Jane and Elizabeth's experience with Mr. Collins is that Jane is sitting there saying, I'm sure he means well. And Elizabeth is saying, he's here to gloat. Now, if we then say, he doesn't actually mean well, if we've made, and I say we've made a choice, except we haven't made a choice usually, it's a matter of perception. It's not a matter of interpretation where we sit around and we say, I wonder if he means well or if he was trying to gloat. Right? What happens is our subconscious makes that decision for us. And we see it and we say, that's what happened. And we think we know what happened without even realizing it. Once we've decided that he doesn't mean well, then you can do what Elizabeth does, stay polite and find a way to just make him go away as quickly as possible. Or you can do what Job does, which is be openly furious and insulting. If we look at what Job says, he openly says, I've become a laughingstock to my friends, to his friends. Then he said, you smear me with lies, you're worthless physicians, all of you. If only you would be altogether silent, for you that would be wisdom. I've heard many things like these, you are miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? How long will you torment me and crush me with words? Right? He has the same opinion about his friend's motives, whether rightly or wrongly, that Elizabeth has about Mr. Collins's. but he doesn't bother to stay polite. Right? Now, so you've got these different possibilities. Someone says something that's insensitive, and you can say, I'm sure they mean well, and you can respond to their good intent, and you can swallow your annoyance and give them grace. And I think a lot of people, especially Christians, if we're not thinking about Job, we naturally kind of assume that we'll try to give people grace because we know people are insensitive. But beyond that, let's say that my friend has said this highly insensitive thing, and I have, because I'm hurt and I'm angry, and I let him have it. Right? I say, so, I'm a bad father? Well, thank you very much. Right? And I let him have it. Now, how would we expect that an ordinary, decent person would react? If you were the guy who said something and the person blows up and says, I can't believe you said this to me, right?
Sorry, I was only trying to help.
Exactly, exactly. We'd be saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, right? That's one possibility. But there are two different tones of voice with which we can say, I was only trying to help, right? So one of them is, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that, I just wanted to help, I didn't want to hurt, right? Or you can say, well, I was only trying to help, excuse me. Right? Right? Now, imagine that you're a bystander and you have listened to this conversation. Right? If my friend gives me the, well, excuse me, I don't know what your problem is, I'm just trying to help, I think most of us would, in the first place, we would have said, what were you doing when they said the first thing? Then if they get mad, we'd be like, what is your problem? This guy, right, he's lost his kid. Job's friends go straight to anger. So Job's friends give him the, what's your problem? We're just trying to help reaction. When Eliphaz basically says, you know, if you'll just repent of whatever terrible sin you've committed, then God will stop punishing you, which, among other things, has the very straightforward and direct implication that his children are dead because he is a sinful person. That it's his fault his children are dead. Job complains, wow, this is not what I need to hear right now, but he doesn't really go off on Eliphaz in full beast mode, so to speak. Bildad's reaction is, how long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind. Bildad doesn't just respond angrily, he escalates. He comes back madder than Job. And when Zophar gets his turn to talk, are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock? Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. You deserve worse than you're getting. And when Eliphaz gets another turn, your sin prompts your mouth. You adopt the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, not mine. Your own lips testify against you. So, what happens here is that of all of the reactions that you could expect Job to have to friends who come in and say insensitive, painful things, his reaction is at the extreme end of the anger spectrum. And then, of all the reactions that you could expect his friends to have to his response, their response is at the extreme of the anger spectrum. Right? If you think about how an ordinary person responds to the clueless and sensitive people, we kind of say they're stupid, and we say they mean well, and we try to do our best to be nice to them. But nobody expects us to be reasonable when we've been bereaved. Right? And yet, a really surprising percentage of people are. A really surprising percentage of people have Henry's reaction and say, I know they mean well, of course I give them grace. But when they do get angry, well, nobody gets more grace for being angry from everybody who knows them than someone who has just gone through tragedy. Right? But in the book of Job, Job's wife only has one line, but she's clearly mad. Job gets mad, okay, well, he's been hurt a lot. Then his friends get furious with him, seemingly at the drop of a hat. And when Elihu shows up, this is how he's introduced. But Elihu, son of Barachel, the Boothside of the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job and yet had condemned him. Now Elihu had waited before speaking to Job because they were older than he. But when he saw that the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. And furthermore, he spends 4 chapters talking, and it's kind of difficult to figure out exactly what point Elihu intends to make because he's kind of incoherent. And the reason is he's mad. And he talks like an angry person. So, the book of Job doesn't show anybody really behaving with effective love. It shows a huge amount of anger. A highly unusual amount of anger. So it's not, we think of the book of Job as being about suffering, and it is. But it is also a book about anger. And that gets us to small group discussions. And the only problem with this, so I really wanted lots of small group discussions and did not realize that one of the other Sunday school classes was being canceled. And everybody in that class is going to have to find someplace else to go. So we can get in 3 or 4 groups in a minute. We've got 3 questions, so I'm going to sort of give you some guidelines. First of all, please don't try to think of this as a Bible study. All right? Think of it that the book of Job tells one guy's story. When Paul writes in his letters, and he writes theology, he's writing general rules that cover everybody, by and large, right? This is one story. And it's a story that's deliberately at the extreme edge of everything. It's at the extreme edge of how much suffering he undergoes, and it's at the extreme edge of the anger and the interactions. And stories like that can only be understood by comparison with the more ordinary experience, right? They're intended to go to the extreme in order to highlight stuff that's not necessarily as clear in an ordinary situation where there's a lot more going on and it can be a lot more confusing, right? So, to understand Job, the ordinary stories that don't turn out as badly as Job's are important for you to understand Job, because the whole point is, what's the difference? What is it that causes things to go so bad with Job? Not with his suffering, we know what causes that, but when Job's friends come to comfort him and they wind up screaming at each other and ultimately get to where they just won't even talk to each other, when it degenerates to the point where they can't even speak to each other. That's not how it turns out for us most of the time. So what is going on? This is what I want to focus on for the rest of the class. How do we keep our stories, if we suffer tragedy or if we're trying to comfort somebody, how do we make sure that it doesn't careen off into the Job stuff? So let's start with Job's anger. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the possibilities for Job's anger. It's possible that Job is being entirely unreasonable. It's possible that his friends genuinely mean well and that Job is not giving them any grace. And we've talked about the fact that there isn't any place in the book where Job gives anybody a break if he thinks they're behaving badly. So that's certainly a possibility. It is also possible that the reason Job thinks that his friends are enjoying his misery is that they're actually enjoying his misery. I'll give you two examples from my own childhood. I grew up in southeast Oklahoma, in the mountains. Grew up in going back and forth between Disciples of Christ churches and Baptist churches. And one of my friends, when I was 17 and he was 16, I thought about him when I was putting this together because he was killed in a car accident shortly after getting his driver's license. In this case, it wasn't his fault. Another driver ran a red light and plowed into him. So we had a benefit concert for him, and in southeast Oklahoma, you had to provide your own, right? So people just volunteered to sing. And one of the junior high boys in our church volunteered to sing a song. And the song he picked was the Amy Grant song, Angels, off the Straight Ahead album, which people my age think, oh, no, he didn't. But those of you who are, for whom Amy Grant is oldies, the song Angels is about how God provides us with guardian angels to keep bad things from happening. And the second verse actually starts, God only knows the times my life was threatened just today. A reckless car ran out of gas before it ran my way. He sang that song. And the boy's mother got up and ran out of the church. I can guarantee you there was no malice at all. He was just staggeringly clueless. Okay? The counterexample is, I won't talk about it very much, but even when I was 8 or 9 years old, I knew that there was an issue with one particular woman in our church, Sister Reba. I didn't understand at the time that it was actually my first experience with mental illness. And she was genuinely vicious. And at that age, I didn't know what the difference was, but I knew that there was a big difference. She used Christian phrases to sort of insulate herself like a shield, like the old Roman soldiers holding the shield and reaching out from behind the shield with the sword. If she said, and I can to this day, I can hear her tone of voice. If she said, now I say this in the spirit of love, it was about to get ugly. It was about to get really bad. And I watched her do brutal things to people emotionally, and under the cover of, in the spirit of love. Like I say, she had major issues, and her husband wound up serving life in prison for murdering their son-in-law. So that was a messed up. It was a messed up family. She was a messed up person. But I'll guarantee you, if she came over to comfort you and she said something that hurt, that was on purpose. So those are two very extreme, examples from my own experience. And a lot of you guys have your own experience as well. So the first question is, how are we going to tell the difference between incompetence and malice, and partly in other people? But much more importantly, because we are so apt to be deceived about our own motives, and our own motives are so apt to be mixed, how do we make sure that we aren't, in fact, congratulating ourselves or whatever, right? So there are people who are insensitive, there are people who are actually doing damage, and then there are people who are kind of in the middle, kind of doing both at once, because people are complex and kind of messy, right? So just sort of try, I guess, like 3 or 4 groups as best you can, and let's take a few minutes to just talk about how you see the difference and how it shows up, all right? So, go.
autobiography we
It's like 3 or 4 groups. If you can get 4 or 5, that's great. We've done this before in this class, and I said try to get in groups of 4 or 5, and we only got in 2 groups of 4. So just get in whatever group you're comfortable with. And look, the more that you can tie this to stuff that you have actually seen, right? The more that this is real life and not, theoretical examples, the more fruitful this life will be. All right?
You know, like,
Because he's
it might have nothing to
So he has
it might have kind of helped you with your
expectation.
I guess it's just
Okay, whoever's making a point,
maybe
finish it.
he's had like a habit.
I would say though,
But don't start another
nothing
point.
to-
So first he thinks that I don't believe that, and secondly, you as a friend, you should
you mean
angry as
I imagine it's
so should protest. Yeah, so something. But
Okay, I hate to go.
it was definitely not.
We've got 2 more that I want you guys to talk about. So, let's, do we know who's going to talk from which group?
All right. We said the first one and others, it's based on our prior history with them, like what kind of relationship we have with them. I guess it's kind of like we feel like they generally do us good, they're probably trying to do us good, and if they do us harm, they're probably trying to do us harm, I suppose. And then the other one, we were a little bit confused, like it didn't seem like we generally try to be mean to somebody who's suffering. We were just, I think what we thought was maybe if we come from a pretty, I guess, moralistic understanding of things, that something must have caused this, then we could try to teach them a lesson, which may be, in a sense, which would be, mean. But it's not like we're trying necessarily to hurt them. But that is practice.
All right. Back corner.
So we're discussing about how to tell that the people is really mean evil or it's for mean well. So we're thinking one of the way to judge it is by how close, how familiar you're with this person. If it's a total stranger, maybe it's hard to tell. But if it's a person you know at least, so maybe you can tell that maybe it's an extreme situation. He's behaving maybe insensitively or cluelessly. And another thing is about if your self-perception for yourself is different from your friend's perception for you, then you will get angry. You will have this kind of interpretation.
Excellent. Back corner.
I guess I can summarize a little bit. I think from my own perspective, I think as a lot of people said, it's really related to what's the relation. How will you know the person you talk to, that person talk to you? If that person generally is nice, then you probably perceive that's a nice voice, even though it's harsh. But if that person you don't know very well, and you know his behavior, he or her like generally act like really sarcasm or something, really bad, speak with bad, then you probably will like perceive it. So it's related to the history. And then this, I don't know your name, but you talk about like the Book of Job is written by someone else. So it's also like whether this story, whether Job actually get angry and then his friend get angry, is also related to that person who wrote it.
That's exactly right.
Then, like
That's why we actually gave the guy who wrote the book a name for purposes of this class. We call him Jethro, because it's precisely because of that. You actually, when you read the book of Job, you are interacting directly not with Job. You're interacting with Jethro, who had a story that he wanted to tell in a way he wanted to tell it. And we don't have Job's autobiography. We have Jethro's version. That's a very, very good point and very important one. I'm sorry, keep going.
And then you talk about it that like everyone go through a journey to be a more godly life. Like probably the Joe's reacting at that time is also a part of the journey too. Like it later, when he become more godly like, probably he will perceive everything the same. He won't be angry. And I would relate it to some verses is like even though something bad happened and some guys said some bad thing to you, do not repay evil for evil. Let God to deal with the wrath. If I remember right. And then so just like to be more practical, I would say if someone said bad to me, I would keep my anger. Like although I have anger, I will keep it and then say my anger later, deal with it later. Because when you had a bump with the anger, your words will be like totally irrelevant or generate more problem.
Very good. Yeah, it's one thing. Everything that I've been talking about Job in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and about his personality. It's about what we're really describing is who Job is when all of this stuff happens to him. At some time in the last couple of sessions, we'll talk about who we think Job was and how he treated people after this was all over. Because you can presume that it was very different, that he came out as a different person he came in. So most of the time we've been talking about who he is coming into it. But you're absolutely right. We will have to spend some time right towards the end of the class talking about and what is Job like when it's all over and going forward? How do we think he's different? What about this group?
Okay, so we didn't really get to talk about the questions yet, so we kind of talked about a situation where like a person feels obligated to speak truth, like theological truth. For instance, if someone's like loved one just passed away and then someone says something like, oh, we'll see each other in heaven. And then like if the person just very...
Oh no, we won't.
Yeah, it's like you don't know. And that may be theologically true, but basically we were talking about how it's important, I think, when you're trying to tell the difference between competence and malice, like to look at the person's habits. So I guess it's really related to what other people have said in terms of like knowing the actual person and their history. Because if this person is like has a habit of just speaking the truth, then you can more easily like try and like work out in your head, oh, this is probably not an active malice. It's probably just an active like totally not being socially competent. So
Very good. Very good. Now, I have gone backwards, apparently. I want to skip ahead because of what this group started talking about. So the next question was, what are some of the ways that we can hurt people without meaning to? You know what? Let's take about 5 minutes and talk about that. There's a slide on torture by theology. That since this group has absolutely brought it up, we definitely want to talk about that. But there are a couple of other ways as well. Let's assume that somebody is clueless, right? Pretend that Job's friends didn't get angry, right? Take the anger out of it. Pretend that they said what they said because they felt like they had to say it, right? But that they didn't use all the verbal abuse, and that they didn't call him stupid, and that they didn't, right? That they tried to be gentle, right? Is just the stuff that they said. Would it still be hurtful even if their attitude was perfect? And if so, why? And what are the ways that we can bring harm? Obviously, we know that you can. So try to be a little bit more specific about it. And we've already excellent point that people feel like they have to stand up for God and give the truth, you know, whether it hurts or not, tough love, you know. What about other ways as well? And let's do like 5 minutes. All right? And then, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. This may come up, it may not. Go ahead and talk. Because I'm really kind of chasing, basically, I'm trying to listen to what you guys are saying and go. All right, so let's go.
Another question entirely different.
You need, more listen.
That's okay, we're good at that.
Don't look at that.
When I was a freshman in college, I was like 19, I was new. My friend was even
You have to discuss
Like
this.
let's say someone's raging,
All right.
going through a hard time.
Let's, we'll go in reverse order this
Sometimes
time.
if you say
So let this
something
group go
truthful
first.
or loving. Right?
No, don't worry about this, just what did you all say? Yeah,
So we talked about, a lot of times when you are, if you have been warned against something, and then the very by a friend or something, or a parent, and then the very thing that you're warning against actually happens, the last thing you kind of want to hear from them when they come to you in your suffering is that I told you so, right? And you actually just kind of want to have someone there to, like if you were in the hospital bed and something happened to you, you wouldn't want them to say, I told you so. If you're in extreme pain, you wanted just them to sit next to you and hear you so. And what was interesting that in this story, actually, Job's friend sat with him for 7 days and said nothing to him, and they finally just unleashed it on him after 7 days of silence. And I think we all understand that we prefer to have somebody who's maybe just sitting there in silence, just our other hand, their hand on our shoulder, or giving us a hug, and just letting us, just listening to what we have to say, just kind of what they did.
Yeah. Silence is a very useful thing.
Maybe I guess. I think one thing is I bring the last one. He talked about that the way you just usually act, because we usually do things in our normal way, thinking ourselves in our own approach. So for example, like I really agree. Like I'm science, you're engineer. But when we deal with the problem, we always, if something happened to that person, we always want to talk the problem and then find out the solution from the reason. But if you like talk that right away with some people, probably that approach could anger some people because you bring the suffering again and again, right? So it's just when you I think one way people make hurt people is just your natural way to deal with the people. And then the other things I think is just I said is you didn't think too much, or you didn't think deeply how suffering go through, how much suffering that a person go through, and you just speak. You didn't think on his or her feet. You just speak normally, and then that usually comes out by the time to some chance to hurt people. And then the other thing, I'm trying to think of what are you talking about. Oh, sorry, I can't remember. Can you say it? What are you talking about?
I was just saying that, yeah, if you don't know what you're, so I was thinking that the conflict between Job and his friends was that his friends had this righteous anger, but they were more accusing to Job, and even though he was technically blameless, and so it's, yeah, there was this misunderstanding between them.
Very good. Back corner.
Just some personal examples. I think when you can hurt people without meaning to, when you don't fully believe what they're saying. So I think in this example, clearly Job's friends
didn't necessarily see eye to eye with what he was doing or you know, what he said he did. Second thing is when you assume things about the other person, so making assumptions about their situation or about what they're feeling, I think can oftentimes that can lead to hurt because it's like, well, I'm not feeling that way. And then, the last thing, I think timing. So, you know, like a lot of times if you're grieving or if you are experiencing something, even the correct truth, and even when it's born out of love, can still come at an inappropriate time, or when someone's not ready to receive that. So I think that can, you can hurt people that way too.
Absolutely.
I guess we could, maybe 2 points. One is it'll hurt if you're being condescending, like in the video. He said it not in an angry way, Mr. Collins. But obviously his attitude of pride came through there. And the second one is just similar to what Steph said, just saying wrong things. Like I think they were saying you need to, they had an incorrect assessment of the situation. And so they were blaming it on something Joe had did, and it wasn't that at all. And then, of course, the question did come up, can we should say what is true, well, but I think it's hard to say what is actually the reason and things more. So Vince also says maybe less is more, like maybe we shouldn't try to say too much because we might be saying things that we don't.
Tell you what,
I have a
think-
question though.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, do you think that a lot of this discussion is sort of encouraging people not to even try? You know, I feel like maybe this is a lot is concentrating on things like, oh, don't make sure you don't say this to be harmful or hurtful. But you know, some of the
That's good. That's good.
so I just feel like you know that a lot of at the beginning the three friends showed up and sat and didn't say anything for 7 days. And I can't remember if that's actually true, but I feel like you know that's being really that's being helpful. You know, so just.
You know, I think that that's something that I think is very, I think I've learned this firsthand. But is there anything that you can think, irrespective of what they actually said, can you think of anything to say to Joe that would make him feel better? Do you think that there's anything that you can say? Do you think that there's...
And not to say anything, but just that if somebody did call, and offer to pray with you, or
absolutely,
ask how your day was.
Food, it makes a remarkable difference to just not have to.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I was saying. I think that this is the presence of being over there, serving them, like bringing food, or just asking to pray with them, those kinds of things. But if you're going to offer advice, you're in depth that's beyond what you're capable of doing. Okay. And I think that that's kind of, tell you quite honestly, going through what I'm, God himself could have said something to me. It wouldn't have relieved my pain. Okay?
So
I mean, it's just...
I do think that somebody coming along and showing concern, that was smile.
Absolutely. I think for me, it was huge. I mean, I think that there were plenty of people that came by and just sat with us, prayed with us, sent food, or just whatever, just thoughtful gestures, But again, there were just a few people that felt like they had to give us advice. They had to feel like, for some reason, they had to say something.
But then don't you think that knowing that people will say sensitive things or didn't mean to, wouldn't you be very grateful and just forgive them? Because
absolutely, that's the first thing that we had discussed. It was just like, these guys all mean good. And you know that. Otherwise they wouldn't be here.
Right. At least trying. Even if it was not the right.
I'll tell you where we're going to start, because we're out of time. I was going to skip ahead to torture by theology, and then this has just come up. So the two things that I think drive a remarkable percentage of it, you guys both mentioned. And when we're talking about advice, you're talking about you naturally approach things as an engineer and so forth. This is the sort of thing, and Henry's saying, is there anything that you could say that could have eased Joe's pain? And the answer is obviously not. One of the biggest problems, and this is a bigger problem for men than it is for women, that's just a generalization, obviously there are exceptions, but it is the natural response for a whole bunch of people is to try to solve the problem. And if there is no solution to the problem other than living through it and enduring, then whatever solution you offer probably is going to make the problem worse. It's probably not going to be neutral, right? So we'll start talking, and look, the problem is, this is a mindset, this software mindset is a mindset that leads to a great deal of success in a whole lot of areas of life, and it leads to catastrophe when you're trying to comfort people. So we'll start with that, and then we'll do torture guy theology, and then we've got one more question, and that's what we'll do starting next week. So thank you guys very much, and let's close it.
Dear Heavenly Father, God, these situations and these questions are all very tricky. God, we pray that we may turn to your Son Jesus as the example of truth and grace, even though we'll never be like him in knowing the motives and the needs of all people around us. God, I pray that we may see him as our role model and as our example, and that we may follow him as he walked in truth and grace. Thank you for this time of discussion, and I pray that our lives may reflect your Son's more and more each day. In Jesus' name we pray.
Thank y'all very, very much.